This is Bucky Stanton, and welcome to Technology Storytellers, brought to you by the Society for the History of Technology. Today I speak with Ashley Rogers, Executive Director for the Whitney Plantation, which provides a unique museum experience centered on the lives of the enslaved. Besides her work as director, she has an MA in History from Colorado State University and is currently a PhD student at Louisiana State University in the Department of History. Ashley discusses the intertwinement of her historical and museum work, the connections between slavery, sugarcane, and industrial labor, and the continued legacies of racial injustice in the area surrounding the Whitney Plantation today. To start us off, you've said that at the Whitney you see people having difficult and heartfelt conversations about race across racial lines. And given the historical context of the Whitney Plantation, these people are also crossing these really interesting and very hard set in our society temporal lines, past and present. Could you start us off by speaking more about this work at Whitney and how it forges the historical connections necessary for those important conversations?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens at Whitney Plantation is that we create an environment here where people feel that it's okay for them to feel upset, and it's okay for them to grieve these things that happened in the past. And that's a sentiment that I've heard repeated here, throughout the 6 years that we've been open by various people of all races. That's not something that we do here in this country very well. We do a lot of minimizing of the history of slavery, history of racism, and everything that came after slavery for the next 100 years. We don't like to talk about it. And in fact, we purposely write it out of our history books and try to convince people that they're imagining it, that there's no reason to be so upset about it. It happened so long ago. But we never do that here. This is a place where we say it is completely appropriate to feel sad, to feel shame, to feel angry. There's so many different ways that you might feel. And the funny thing about allowing people to experience that range of emotions, even for just an hour or two on the site, is that it opens them up. So yeah, I've seen multiple occasions these types of interactions that our society tells us over and over again is inappropriate. Like, it's not appropriate to talk about race. We don't like to do it because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And that's, you have perfect strangers here who have been opened up by their experience and communicate with one another. And the thing that I see here that you don't see online, for instance, right? Like, there's a lot of vitriol. But the thing that I see here is that people have difficult conversations. They have confusing conversations. They don't do it perfectly. They kind of make plotting steps towards figuring it out between themselves. And it's really quite wonderful. One of the, we have a visitor reflection wall, so visitors can leave a little Post-it note. We've had to shut it down for COVID-19, unfortunately, because too much touching. But for 5 years, we had that up. And recently, earlier in the spring, there was a note that said, "Now I can cry without shame." And it really spoke to me, that it just, people get told so often that they're not allowed, that they shouldn't, there's no reason to. And I think that, we show people that there's all the reason in the world. But it's also, as you point out, it's a site that also allows us to celebrate the survival, the resistance, and the triumphs, and the cultural legacies too of these enslaved Africans.
Yeah, and what I mean by celebrate, it's not like a cheery tone. It's something you don't see in America. It's the names of these people, these enslaved people, and then where they were from. And oftentimes it was directly from places in Africa or like places you wouldn't even expect. But for example, I didn't know about the enslavement of people from Angola really as a center of enslavement until my trip to the Whitney, and this was a whole new history. And then by celebration, even a really somber and what some might think is depressing monument about a uprising of enslaved people near kind of the end of the route that we're at least supposed to go on. It felt like a celebration to me because it vindicated this righteous rage. It vindicated this emotion, like you were saying, and there's something celebratory, even if it's somber, in that. And so, could you just, before we move on to kind of what's the big rest of your historical work, could you just what do you do specifically at the Whitney that's unique, that forges these connections, or what's your strategy?
Mm-hmm. Well, so, our singular focus is on the interpretation of slavery. So it's people are in the South, at least, quite used to plantation tourism. And typically a plantation tour would be a tour of a mansion. And, you would hear about all of the family. You would hear how hard it was for them during the Civil War, and you'd look at all of their beds and their linens and things, and then you'd, I don't know, drink a mint julep on the porch. So that's kind of the typical plantation experience, oftentimes excluding slavery 100%, or misnaming people and calling them servants instead of enslaved people. So Whitney Plantation is not like that. There are two things that are really centrally different to who we are and what we do. The first being the fact that our interpretive focus is exclusively on the experience of enslaved people. And the second, that it is really a memorial site. And you alluded to the many memorials that we have there that display people's names. On the traditional guided tour, which we aren't offering anymore because of COVID, on the traditional guided tour, the tour would begin in a series of memorials that we built on the site to honor people who were enslaved. So it kind of sets the tone of the tour of being one that's a little bit more reflective. And those memorials are still on the tour. Today, people are taking an audio tour on a downloadable app. So they're in a little bit of a different route. But even so, it's pretty much the same experience. And we really minimize the story of the white slave owning family. The big house is not a major focus. We don't go inside of the big house. You walk around outside of it, but don't go inside and see all of the lavish, stuff that's in there. So it really is just, completely different from a typical plantation tour.
Yeah, and I can confirm that a lot of plantations around, because we did this big van driving tour to various locations. There was plenty of other plantation sites that were advertised on the road as places to hold a wedding, which, as a Yankee from up north, is something I did not know was a frequent practice. Well, you sent me some historical work, some of your writing, and it was based off a presentation, or very similar to a presentation that you gave at our tour, which connected the plantation structure to the arrival of industry and situated it in what the area right now is around. And for context for the viewers, a lot of this trip at the Anthropocene campus, led by Scott Knowles and Kim Fortune, was based around understanding the history of this place called Cancer Alley, a place, a predominantly Black population outside and near the Whitney, outside Louisiana, New Orleans, and near the Whitney plantation, that is surrounded by petrochemical facilities in such a way that they have a lot of health and just general life impacts to their community. And so when I read your history, what really hooked me, and good thing it hooked me because it was like the second paragraph, you stated, quote, "If it weren't for the plantations, after all, big industry wouldn't be here." And it's big industry. It's huge petrochemical plants, huge flames at night that you can see. So could you outline this history for the audience of how we went from this traditional plantation, which the audience can kind of think up in their head in a way, which we'll get to that in the question after this, but then extend it how we got to the petrochemicals that haunt a place like Cancer Alley.
Right. Yeah. And Whitney Plantation is right in the middle of Cancer Alley. So this is the corridor, the corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is that section of Louisiana that has the largest concentration of petrochemical plants. And that's also the section of Louisiana that had the largest concentration of sugar plantations. And so, it's hard. I think when you first come here, you might not notice it right away because of course a lot of the damage to the landscape, to the environment of these industries is invisible, right? But once you come out here more and more, you start to notice how many plants there are, you know, and you drive on the skyline, you know, you can see them in the distance, they're everywhere. So it was a question that started to kind of bother me about how they all ended up here. And, you know, as you start kind of unraveling that thread, you find that the connections between these major industries and the plantations, it becomes somewhat obvious, you know, why they're all here. So the petrochemical industry arrived in Louisiana in 1909, so early 20th century. The first one that came was Standard Oil. And so the reason why they came is because initially, because oil was found in 1906. So the Evangeline oil well, which was west of New Orleans. But so Standard Oil follows, they come to Baton Rouge, and they bought a cotton plantation that was right there on the river. Shell comes shortly thereafter, and then it's just this snowball from that period around 1910 to the time of World War II. You have something like 150 petrochemical plants that established. Because what happens once you have a refinery is that then you start to have all these other products that become possible, and they build pipelines, and so they're connecting between each other. But you have to think about, like, what was the environment that they were buying into? That's the important question to ask. And I think that if it doesn't seem obvious, it's because I think people fundamentally misunderstand what a plantation is and was, right? Because we've done such a good job of communicating to ourselves, to our society, that a plantation is a mansion through plantation tourism. That's what people think it is, right? And they somehow completely forget about the industrial scale labor that is the exact purpose that the plantation even existed. So why do these petrochemical plants want river frontage and this land? It's the same reason why the plantations wanted it, right? So the plantations in Louisiana were set up along the river, along the Mississippi River, and they were set up there because they wanted trade access, right? So they wanted to be able to get these, they were making large scale commodities that they had to be able to ship out, get out to a major port, which was New Orleans, and get it out around the world. So that's the reason why they're there along the river, right? They purchased these huge tracts of land because they're producing commodity crops. So they have to have a lot of land to be able to grow enough to produce the type of goods that they're producing. In this part of Louisiana, it's mostly sugar. Once you get up towards Baton Rouge, you start to see cotton. But sugar is really kind of the crop that I'm so interested in because of the parallels with industry. So in 1900, when all of this stuff is starting, in 1909, when Standard Oil is coming, they're not having to negotiate with multiple landowners, right, to do these big land deals. They bought one plantation, and that's all it took. They talked to one property owner and bought the entire thing, right? Who's there who might protest the construction of these plants as they start snowballing? Who lives in these areas? It's predominantly Black, because these are people who are descendants of enslaved people just a few generations prior. They don't have the right to vote. They have no power in society. And it's really, I mean, what you have in Louisiana is just this kind of like gentleman's club on steroids, right? Where the entire government, all of the businesses are run by this kind of elite core of white men. And so the land deals are happening in those same networks, right? So it's very, very simple. And the petrochemical industries, they all want river access, not only for shipping, but it's hugely important for them for cooling, for all of the cooling that they do in plants. So there's really this kind of perfect environment here to develop these plants. And the fact that so many people who are living here in the river parishes are Black and at that time politically powerless is a really crucial part of that component, of that cocktail that made the plants all come here.
Yeah, and that to me, that story just perfectly contains this transitional state you can see in the plantation from a, almost like high feudal mercantilist thing like the plantation to a very industrial capitalism way of using the land. And it felt to me when we were there that, the local people were almost treated like serfs. It was almost expected that they came with the land and with the history of sharecropping, the history and their political powerlessness, that they were just almost a resource to be managed along with the land or with the oil. And so I wanted, and you so wonderfully connect to our next question, which is kind of about the technology of sugarcane uh, plantations. Because when I took the tour of Whitney, I was utterly shocked with how industrial this sugarcane plantation was. Huge metal objects used for boiling and sifting and sorting out various pieces, uh, huge mechanical contraptions and towers for creating the correct kind of flow from factory to river and vice versa. It was a really technical operation. And then you so wonderfully pointed out in your presentation that day about the labor practices and how many of these enslaved peoples or later kind of sharecroppers who were stuck on the land in a way or serf-like in the land were they were working under conditions that were much more like later industrial factory conditions with long shifts, being kind of almost mathematically calculated where they'll be on the plantation and when, with almost every calorie accounted for. And so could you elaborate more about this technological story and even how it fed into the later industrial practices that we just talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is what I mean about, the petrochemical businesses coming here would seem less mysterious if people understood what sugar was like. It's my contention, and I'm not alone here, that this was already an industrial district. It had been an industrial district since the early 19th century. So sugarcane began to be cultivated on a larger scale in Louisiana. The first sugar plantation owner who successfully granulated a crop of sugar was in 1795. So after that point, they start transitioning this land from indigo, which was already industrial in its own right, to sugarcane. And sugarcane is the most needy of all of the commodity crops that were grown in slave societies. It is the only one that requires a full factory, 2 factories to process that product after the fact, right? So it's not to minimize the labor that happens on a tobacco plantation or a cotton plantation, but you're dealing with crops that are basically picked almost in the same form that they're going to be in their end product, right? And that is not the case with sugarcane. If you think about a sugarcane stalk, which if people haven't seen it, it's about a 10-foot stalk of bamboo is kind of, more what it's like. It's in the grass family. And you have to take that product, that plant, from that state to the sugar that we eat on our table. There's a lot of steps in between. So, and because the crop itself is so persnickety, right? It's like you have to do it all fast. So sugar plantations not only required this large industrial scale production, but they also required a kind of efficiency that wasn't as necessary on these other plantations, right? So basically what happens is that when the sugar reaches the point at which it's ready to start what's called the grinding season or the harvest season, you have to do it in this magical window at the end of the year because it can't actually withstand a freeze. A freeze will totally destroy the crop. So they have to start it in October and get it all finished by December. And further complicating that process is the fact that as soon as you cut into a sugarcane stalk, it starts to degrade. And what degrades about it is the sucrose content. So if what you want is a high sucrose content, because that's going to be a sugar that's much more valuable for the end product, then you have to work as fast as possible to make sure that the cane is getting from the field to the factory. And so you can't have a factory that's very far away. So every sugar plantation had to have a sugar factory on the plantation itself. So you have on every sugar plantation this kind of combination of this industrial space next to this agricultural space. They also used teams of workers that were called crews that worked in different areas of the plantation in order to ensure efficiency. So the people in the fields are not the same people as the people in the sugar mill. And in the sugar mill, as you alluded to, you have all of these boiling vats and things like that. So that process was, they boiled sugar in open kettles until about the 1840s. But basically you have to take the sugar cane, grind it through a grinder, which was steam powered by the 1820s. So we're, already moved from animal labor to mechanical, and using steam power just within 20 years. And then once that's ground with that steam grinder, then that extracts the juice that is on the inside of the cane stalk, which is then boiled in a series of open kettles. So they have, on our sugar mill, there were 2 sets of kettles, and you have sugar makers who are enslaved men who are in charge of this process. They also were, because the crop is so needy, right? Technological development was just, it was a necessity, and it was constant. They were always looking for ways to improve this process, because if you improve the process, you improve the quality of sugar and you increase the profits, right? So the open kettle boiling system was still used on a lot of plantations, but some of these sugar plantations were so big that they could afford large investments. So when the multiple effect evaporator was invented by Norbert Rioux in 1845, he was a free man of color and an engineer. When he invented that, that changed the sugar process, but only the largest plantations could afford that apparatus because it was incredibly expensive to implement. So yeah, I mean, this kind of gives you an idea, right? It's just not the same thing as a traditional, what we think of as a traditional agricultural product. So if you already have people who are working in this industrial environment, round the clock and shifts, 24 hours a day, how different is that from working in a refinery? How different is that from working in a factory? It's basically the same thing.
And that paves the way right to kind of the later relationship. It reminds me so much of work I came in contact with in Amy Slayton's at Drexel, her History of Labor, American Labor class, and it was a book about a enslaved set of blacksmiths, and I think it was in Virginia, but it had a lot of these similar themes, and it really questioned this boundary of this agriculture and this industry and the times, and it really, these cases like this make so apparent the connections between these systems over time. Mm-hmm. So with this technical story, I want to ask you, what approaches from the history of technology or history generally do you find useful for wrapping this kind of mixing of historical processes together? Because it's a complex story. I mean, you're doing it yourself some justice in how clear you tell it, that yes, when you tell it, it appears clear and obvious, but you started at one point not with this story planned out. How'd you wrap it all together?
Yeah, I don't know really, but I find that the history of business is really interesting to me, and I think I became fascinated with this story from a perspective of like how we don't view, and I may not answer your question the right way, so I'll try, but we don't tend to view slavery and plantations as part of labor history, which is odd. We kind of remove slavery as if it's not really the history of labor, it's something else, it's cultural history or something else. But I'm really fascinated by the management aspect of like how they organize their plantation and what would have been the most logical way to do things under that illogical rubric that they were working with, right? And then how does that continue? Because the other thing that I find so fascinating is, of course, these connections and continuities. that go not just from one industry to another, but even continuing on the plantation. So that is something that I always really wanted to explore. And I think, the work inside of the sugar mill, it took me so long to understand it, and I felt like I wasn't understanding the slavery here. I couldn't understand, what life would be like for an enslaved person if I didn't understand the labor, because the labor is really what's their entire life is about. Their whole life is organized around this forced labor. So oddly, the way that, because I am this type of person, the way that I had to wrap my brain around the fact that this is a factory, the moment that it happened for me was when I visited a working sugar mill. And I went to a sugar mill, I don't know, a couple years ago. And, and I could see the whole process. I saw the grinders, and I saw the sugar syrup coming out, and I saw the vats boiling it, and the people in the hard hats. And that factory was still on the plantation in the exact spot it had always been on. We drove in on the quarter road past the plantation big house and through all of where the slave quarters are, where the migrant workers are still working and living on that site in those former slave cabins, and then drove to the factory. And I thought, in a lot of senses, it seems like a normal factory, but it crystallized for me in a lot of ways. And I started to understand how, it's not that different. They're using some different materials, but actually they're using a version of the multiple effect evaporator, the same one that was invented in 1845. And they have a little control room with these guys in lab coats. And those are the chemists who are testing the sugar to make sure that it is, in the right spot where it's supposed to be. Well, that's the work that used to be done by the sugar maker, who was in charge of the boiling process, who at one time had to do it by sight and by testing it with spoons, but later on the plantation owners started to learn from French chemists and introduce chemistry into their sugar mills. So I guess, I don't know, I think that learning about the technology on the plantation really helped me to understand the people a lot better. These people who were enslaved here were experts in this. This is those people who are in those lab coats in the sugar mill today. Those are good jobs, and the plantation owners who got so rich off of the people who knew how to make sugar, they had to rely on people who really had a lot of expertise. But I couldn't come to that conclusion if I didn't understand the technology.
I think you answered that question quite well. You almost kind of give an almost STS-y historical anthropology there, where you're kind of connecting these, like you said, continuities and discontinuities through the technology and their concomitant social systems, but also the differences. Like, to me, it's so striking what you just said about the chemist being one of the best paid positions in that industry, and it was an enslaved position before.
Yeah.
In many ways, to the book I referenced earlier, the foreman is a better paid position than most in an iron factory these days, but it was done by an enslaved man. And I think there's a lot to grasp onto there with the connection between wage labor too and slavery, and that's transfer in labor profiles, and how, for me, it just put the entire history of America in a different context. And so, to close us out here, I just want to say that I think your work does some of the most fantastic I've ever seen at showing why a historical perspective is vital for understanding both place, people, and the present we're in. And we brought it up a couple times, but just to circle back to the wage slavery connection, industrial agriculture connection here, Cancer Alley is full of people who are free citizens now, who work jobs, who are experts in many things, but they're still facing a sort of oppression that I could only sense from my time with you. I'm sure I could have gotten shreds of it if I had spent the time, but I was only in New Orleans for so long. But through your tour and through the Whitney and through that weekend, that thing I knew from articles and books about citizen science in the field of science technology studies became something very alive and real still. It didn't feel like an abstract exercise anymore. And it really took the breath out of so many of us, especially when we talk to members of that community. And so considering your historical work and your vitally important work at Whitney Plantation, I want to ask you one primary question and then just a interrelated ending question. So the first big question is, what general lessons can we draw from your history and your public history work for how we can, I don't want to say heal America because that says like almost restore it to some point, make America something that handles this better is maybe a better way to say it. How can we intervene on the past and come to bear with this, horrible agricultural history in many places with other products like indigo and tobacco, but also this violent technological modernity story that is a little bit more apparent in these sugarcane stories. And then second, I just want us to enumerate how we and the audience can learn about and help the people in Cancer Alley right now from a distance if we're not involved in that research.
Yeah. Well, I think that both of those might have the same answer, which is listening to the people who are from here. The reason why the people of the river parishes are living in this dangerous environment in Cancer Alley is the reason why it is Cancer Alley is because people didn't listen to them and didn't care about their voices, right, for so long. And so there got to be just unchecked growth. These sugar plantations had to get rezoned for all of the plants to be able to come. There was widespread corruption, and just kind of, and again, even when it's not outright corruption, this kind of old boys network that I referenced, that happened at Whitney Plantation. Whitney Plantation was supposed to be the world's largest rayon manufacturing plant. And it was zoned industrial illegally. And so there were kickbacks involved. It was a whole thing. And people weren't listening to the residents who were saying, we don't want this here, and the residents continue now to say, we don't want this here. And so I think that listening to these stories is really important because we all in this country use the products that are made here in South Louisiana, and we really don't think about the human and the environmental impacts of those products. It kind of just becomes this out of sight, out of mind. People don't come here to South Louisiana, but the people here are really connected to the land and they're connected to this place because it is their history. And they shouldn't have a death sentence for wanting to live in the place where they're from, So I think that, importantly, the work around this is there's a lot of local groups that are doing work around fighting the petrochemical industry. Rise St. James and Concerned Citizens of St. John are referencing St. James Parish and St. John the Baptist Parish, two of the most polluted parishes here in South Louisiana. And I think that people can give resources to these people. It's really important to note that both of those organizations are heavily made up of African-American women, and especially older African-American women in Rise St. James. And Rise St. James is currently fighting Formosa in St. James Parish. And the grounds on which they're fighting it right now is the fact that Formosa just found a slave cemetery on that property with hundreds of people buried there. And they're fighting for the dignity of their ancestors. That's a really key part of this, is that you don't build a petrochemical plant in South Louisiana without building it literally on top of the bones of people's ancestors. And those people have not been given the right to have control over that, to be able to access those grounds. A lot of times people don't even know where those cemeteries are, So I think that people can support those two organizations for sure, and educate them. There's so much out there about Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is also disproportionately affected by COVID-19, in part because of the underlying conditions that become predominant in an environment like this. So that would be my answer.
That's a great answer. And I just want to thank you for coming on to Technology Storytellers and really both laying out this amazing outline of a history, making so many connections, but also just doing your public historical work and continuing to grow the Whitney and make it what it is. I highly recommend if you're in Louisiana, you make it a first stop. I would skip probably half the tourist traps in New Orleans for the Whitney, not half, 99%. Maybe not Bourbon Street, but then Whitney. But thank you so much, and I really enjoyed and appreciated you coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.